This is chapter 3 of the book, Understanding Human Communication. And it is chapter 3 in the new edition, as we've already said, and I'm going to do it in the old edition until I have the new edition. This is on the self, perception, and communication, and that there is an interaction between those three that's very important. First of all, talking about the communication in the self concept is defined as a relatively stable perception, that a set of relatively stable perceptions that each of us hold about ourselves. You'd like to look at your self-perception, your self-concept, sit down and write down a list and just think in I am statements. Write down I am, and then write down your moods or feelings, your appearance and physical condition, your social traits, talents you possess or lack, your intellectual capacity, your belief systems, your strong beliefs, and your social roles. Sit down and do those and look and be honest with yourself and look at the ways that you feel about yourself and the things that you think about yourself. And that helps you to understand more about your self-concept. Now, the book talks about self-esteem. Self-esteem is how we evaluate our own self-worth. The problem is that some people have a high self-esteem. That's not necessarily a problem, although it can be too high, it might be problematic. The other is that sometimes people have a low self-esteem. They have done studies and they know this. People with high self-esteem are more confident in their perceptions and less likely to be swayed by peer pressure. People with high self-esteem are viewed positively by their peers and often are more appreciated and valued by their peers. The opposite is true of people with low self-esteem. People who think poorly of themselves often communicate in ways that cause others to doubt them. Someone who lacks confidence in social situations may avoid parties and study groups, or in a party or social setting may be awkward. Now, self-esteem have a high self-esteem doesn't guarantee success. There are people who have such a high and exaggerated self-esteem that they are arrogant and they become irritating to other people just based on the fact that they think so much more highly of themselves than they ought to. It talks about biology, personality, and the self. The question, of course, for years people have discussed is the question of nature or nurture. Are we born a certain way or are we raised a certain way? And I have 2 children, and the answer, I can tell you the answer, you want to pay attention to this. The answer to nature or nurture, are we born a certain way or do we develop a certain way? The answer is yes. Yes, we are born with certain characteristics and certain personality traits in certain ways, but there are other ways, other things in our personality, other things in our character that develop over time. Some external influences on our self-concept. It talks about the influence of significant others. That's not a politically correct term, by the way. It's just literally people who are significant in our lives, significant others. Our parents are the first influence on our self-concept. Then we go to college, or to college, we go off to grade school, and it becomes our teachers, and then our friends and our peers can start to influence our self-concept. Even the culture in which we grow up can have an impact on our self-concept. Certain Asian cultures value modesty, whereas in the United States and Canada, the individual has a certain level of esteem that we hold people in because they're very good at something. Talked about the self-concept and communication with others. There are ways in which our self-concept starts to shape how we communicate with other people. If we think of ourselves as shy, then we're in a social setting, and then we behave in a shy way, we find ourselves feeling awkward, then it just reinforces that perception that we have ourselves, that we are shy. And that can change. I've even seen parents who told other people that their children were shy. You don't want to do that. And in front of them, right there, oh, he's so shy, she's so shy. That all you're doing is then creating a self-concept for that child later in life. That's not the way to do it. It talks about the self-fulfilling prophecy, where we have a certain way that we think about ourselves, and then we live up to that. One of the examples I've used is people who think, well, I'm bad at taking tests. And someone who thinks that they're bad at taking tests will probably do a couple of things. One is they may study a little bit less than other people. That will lead to a bad grade, which then, of course, reinforce reinforces that self-concept or part of the self-concept that says I'm bad at taking tests. And another thing that someone may do is they may second guess themselves when they're taking the test. They second guess their own answers. They've done studies of this. They know this. When we second guess ourselves and change our answers on tests, more often than not, we're changing it from the right answer to the wrong answer. So that's problematic. And then of course we see that as having verified the fact that we thought we were not good at tests, and it increases that self-concept. Some steps in the perception process. One is selection. We cannot hear everything that's going on around us, but we pay attention to certain things. If you've ever been in a crowded mall and you heard a friend's voice that you recognized, and it just stood out from all the other voices, that's selection. We organize those things that we pay attention to, certain physical constructs, role constructs, interaction constructs, and psychological constructs. What we think of certain things that are said and how people convey it and comport themselves. What we think of that, then we select certain things to pay attention to, and then we give value to them. We then interpret that input that we have selected to pay attention to. Some influences on perception. One is physiological. How each of us experiences the world shapes perception. Age can shape your perception. I always told my students that, when I was 20, I thought 30 was old. Then I became 30. Then I thought, well, 40 is old. Then I became 40. Then I thought 50 is old. Well, now I'm 64, and I don't think I'm old. Although most of my life I might have thought of myself as old. Now I think of 80 as old, but think of it however you want to, of course. There are certain health and nutrition issues that can affect us. Some people become grumpy when they don't have enough to eat, or they're a little hungry. Biological incidents that go on. We have cycles of feelings of how we feel. Sleep patterns can be disrupted. That can create problems. Talks about culture and social influences. Some of those are that can be affected. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter, like chapter, I think it's 4 or 5, whatever it may be. We'll talk about that later. Some sex and gender roles. We talk about the book talks about how we sort of, at times, we will attempt to create a certain way that people, our children act based on their sex. Now, understand the book talks about sex. Sex is biological. Gender is not just biological. It's a factor of a socially constructed set of expectation about what it means to be masculine or feminine. And we need to understand this. When I say that there are masculine males and there are feminine males, it does not have anything to do with sexuality. So, because a man is more in touch with his feminine side does not somehow inherently mean that he is gay. Neither does a woman who is possibly has certain masculine characteristics or ways that we think about people we consider masculine. Neither does that mean that a woman who has those characteristics is gay either. Those are totally different things, by the way. It's about occupational roles. How we see the world can depend on whether we're the boss or whether we're the employee. It's an important thing. We have relational roles. Relational roles are important because how we think of and how we treat each other is based on those relational roles. Our self-concept of how we would react to something our mom or dad said will be very different than how we might react to our brother or sister or possibly a child that we have. Those are different roles that we play, and it's appropriate to have those roles. It talks about narratives, perception, and communication. Our personal stories of our life are the narratives, the stories we create and use to make sense of our personal worlds. It's also how we get to know each other. We tell each other our narratives. We share our narratives and what we've been through with other people. That's page 49, at least in this edition, 13th edition, I think it is. The next page talks about common perceptual tendencies. One is that we tend to make snap judgments. And oftentimes when we do that, we judge people incorrectly. We've made a snap judgment. That's problematic. We do stereotyping, where we judge other people based on the stereotypes of how we think other people are. A young black man in my class a few years back, 6'7", said he was really sick of people asking him if he played basketball. Well, not every 6'7" black man likes, but he actually didn't like basketball alone and never played it. So, but we do that though. It's a problem in our human condition is that we often pigeonhole people based on certain characteristics we think as having some meaning that it may or may not have. So we often judge ourselves more charitably than we judge others. I call it a self-serving bias. If someone else is late, well, why are they late? If I'm late, well, I have a reason why I'm late. so that sort of serves me, but not the other person. We tend to pay more attention to negative impressions than positive ones. That can be problematic. We're influenced oftentimes by what is most obvious about a person. That can also be problematic. We cling to first impressions oftentimes, even if they are wrong. You've heard the phrase, probably heard the phrase, you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. That's an important thing to remember. We tend to assert that other people are similar to us. I call this the universalization of our faults, the universalization of our faults. If I do it, well, everybody does it. So I speed a little. Well, everybody speeds. Well, not everybody speeds. But people who speed tend to think everybody speeds. Anyway, talks about perception and mediated communication. It's extremely important that we understand this. There is the ability to create false personas. TV shows have been done about it. Movies have been done about it. The ability of people to create a false presence, a false persona that they then present to other people in order to take advantage of them in some way, possibly get money from them, other things along that line. So perception and mediated communication is something we need to think about. Empathy, perception, and communication. Talked about empathy being ability that one is just perspective taking, be able to take the other person's perspective. We cannot do that in everything. We cannot do that in everything. When my son passed away a number of years ago, I had someone tell me one time, well, I know just how you feel. I said, really? You had a child die? And they went, no, I didn't. I went, well, then I guess you don't know just how I feel then. Sympathy, we feel bad for someone. We may have empathy in the fact that we may have a sense of how someone may feel, but because of certain things, we may not have the same empathy that we might have. Good thing to do perception checking. If someone passes you in the hall and you say hi and they don't say hi, you might think that they're angry at you or something to that effect. But if you do a perception check, you might find out that they didn't even hear you as you walked by. A perception check involves a description of the behavior you noticed, two possible valid, non-judgmental, by the way, interpretations of the behavior, and then a request for clarification. We do identity management. With our communication, we do identity management. We have our perceived self, how we perceive ourselves to be. And then we have our presenting self, which is how we present ourselves to others. We do what's called face work, where we collaborate together to help each other create certain ways that we are. And that's not a false thing. It's not a fake thing. In identity management, we have multiple identities. It does not mean we have split personalities. It just means we have multiple identities. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm a teacher. I don't tend to present things the same way. I've yet to go home and lecture to my wife in this book. That would be a bad idea. I didn't talk to my children and to my wife the same way because they're different identities and different roles that we're playing. Our identity management is collaborative. It can be conscious or unconscious, something very important to think about. And of course, people differ in their degree of identity management. There are people who have no filter. Say whatever, I've had people say things in front of myself and my wife. I was like, why did that person say that? I have no idea. The person doesn't have a filter. That's problematic. When people don't have a filter at all, we tend to think of them, and they tend to be a little bit socially inept because they have no filter. It's problematic. Identity management in the workplace, you want to proceed with caution. Look at the organization's culture. Consider the consequences of not opening up, and test the waters. It's very important that we understand that almost every major employer out there checks social media. They check your social media before they hire you, and they will be checking your social media as you work for them. And if you go online and you start criticizing the people in your company, maybe your boss, and that gets back to them, I'm not going to have a job. That's problematic. You need to be careful about that. Why do we manage identities? Well, a lot of it is because it's the right way to do things. We have certain social rules and that dictate how we present ourselves to other people. And sometimes there are literally rules about how we present ourselves possibly in court, things along that line. But it's primarily social. And we don't act toward our husband and wife the same way we act toward casual acquaintances. That would be inappropriate, as you can probably easily figure that out. Identity management and mediated communication, it's very, very important that we understand that mediated communication is problematic in the fact that we can easily be deceived by somebody. And then, of course, there's a question about identity management and honesty. there is a point in time where if you develop this relationship, this certain level of seriousness, we need to be more open about certain things. I know of a couple that got engaged, and they were engaged, and after they became engaged, she found out he had a child. Problematic. He did eventually work it out, and they talk her back into marrying him. But after you got engaged is not the right time to let somebody know that you have children. That's a little late. You need to let that out earlier. So we have to be careful, because at a certain point in time, when we hold certain things back from people, we can be engaging in an identity management that is false and fake and inappropriate. So that's a very important thing to think about. One of the most important things about that I can tell you in terms of social media, especially, is that we have to understand there's a permanence out there. Pictures you put online, other things like that, they can get passed around, and people can have them that you don't want to have them. That's problematic. So that's the end of chapter 2, though. Get this done.